The Renaissance of Southern Europe is now remembered for its battle cry, ad fontes, back to the sources. The rediscovery of ancient long-lost texts, the recovery of the ability to read those texts in their original languages, and the hope to return to primordial wisdom most near to the divine. Along with Roman history, Greek literature, there is also now intensive research focused on the recovery of the lost mystical wisdom of the ancients, their magical practices, and the mysticism that would, in all hopes, reunite the human with the divine. Add to that research into Egyptian hieroglyphics, ancient Hebrew, and Kabbalistic lore, but also the very power of symbolism itself was now flourishing as a metaphysical discipline. But as the ideals of the Renaissance spread beyond the Alps, far to the north of Europe, similar ideas took root among the Germanic peoples, especially of Scandinavia, who also began to take interest in their own primordial past, the lost world of the Norse and the mysterious alphabet they used to preserve their wisdom, the runes. At the very heart of the origins of runology stands the 17th century polymath, writer, antiquarian, and mystic Johannes Bureus, along with preparing the first systematic study of the Swedish runic inscriptions and the first Swedish alphabet book in which runes feature very prominently. He also composed a volume on Esoteric Runology, the first such volume in modern history, in which he argued that the truths of philosophy, theology, and primordial Norse wisdom could be recovered, what he termed Runic Kabbalah. In collaboration with the fantastic channel Nordic Animism, I'm eager to dive into the very origins of modern runic mysticism and magic. Runa will be covering contemporary interest in the runes and rune magic as well, so make sure to check out his companion video as well. And of course, if you're interested in magic, hermetic philosophy, alchemy, Kabbalah, or the history of the occult, or just the arcane in general, things like the history of runes, make sure to subscribe here and check out my other content on topics in esotericism. Also, if you want to support this kind of work, providing accessible, scholarly, and free content on topics on esotericism here on YouTube, I'd hope you consider supporting my work over at my Patreon with a one-time donation via PayPal. You can check out the super thanks option there below the video, or you can check out some of our cool, black metal style merch over at the store tab on the channel. But now let's turn to Johannes Bureus in his Adulruna Rediviva, the rebirth of what he took to be the esoteric dimension of the noble runes and their occult wisdom. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. Interest in the runes, the ancient Germanic writing system of the Norse and Anglo-Saxons, among other peoples, has exploded in the past couple of centuries. From antiquarian and academic interest to their use by the German National Socialists and not so esoteric racists, to tools of divinatory and magical practice among contemporary neo-pagans, the music of fantastic bands like Adulruna, and the Viking pop culture craze that has positively exploded in the past decade or so, interest and use of runes has, I don't think, ever been greater at any moment in history. However, with popular interest has also come widespread misinformation about their actual historical use as far as we can tell from the historical evidence. That evidence reveals that while the runes were employed in some magical contexts, as virtually all writing systems were and are, there's limited reason to believe that they were conceived as especially mystical or magical by their ancient users on their own right. Indeed, the rune poems, from which much of the contemporary magical meaning about the runes is now largely drawn, was thought by scholars now to be probably more of a mnemonic device for their memorization than lessons in their esoteric use. Of course, the runes were probably used to write magical texts. We have good reason to believe that. But the magic was thought to have been much more likely to have been what was written in the runes as opposed to the script that it was written in, i.e. the runes as symbols. The runes were probably considered magical as a tool of writing much more so than, as I said, symbols on their own. Though this is contested, and Rune has some great articles and videos on his channel debating this exact point. Further, the meaning of much of what has come down to us in these magical texts written in the runes is pretty much lost to us. The meaning of repeated strings of runic letters and the mysterious use of words like onion, as well as the famous Alu inscription, which apparently seems to mean beer or ale, are all very likely to remain the subject of intense speculation forever. And when we find, for instance, the word comb written on a, comb, there's no reason to believe there's anything magical going on there. Sometimes the comb is just a comb. Unless ancient people give us a pretty good evidentiary reason to read magic into something, most scholars, including myself, think it's often best to resist that urge because we're much more likely to interpolate our own values, our own wishes, especially for there to be magic there, and our own ideologies about what magic is and isn't into those artifacts, and thus actually distort what that artifact meant, if anything, in antiquity. It was probably just a comb. That's not to say that the runes, especially in the hundreds of carved stones, don't inspire a profound sense of awe and mystery. I can guarantee you they do, at least for me. And especially when the understanding of that meaning was relegated to a tiny contemporary literate population, or when their meaning has been lost through time, such inscriptions and monuments were and are awe-inspiring, even if their actual meaning is often little more than so-and-so carved this in memory of so-and-so, or I belong to so-and-so, or just so-and-so was here. Now, that's often a very touching voice from the past, but only very rarely magical or mystical in any strong sense of those terms, and outside of a handful of obscure references to the origins of the runes, or Odin learning them in Havamal, the evidence for their inherent magical or mystical value is surprisingly scant, given that outside of academic and epigraphic and linguistic studies, the runes are overwhelmingly understood as precisely magical and mystical. It's a bit like if the Latin alphabet faded into obscurity with only some educational poems for learning the NATO alphabet having survived. But then future magicians actually took literally H for hotel, W for whiskey, or X for x-ray, and they thought they could summon or divine or use magical powers to obtain, temporary dwellings, intoxication, or the ability to see through things. But something like that does seem to have happened in early modern, and especially contemporary Western esotericism. And interestingly enough, despite a great deal of interest in both academic, epigraphic, and linguistic studies, along with this supposed esoteric dimension of the runes, the foundational figure in both those regards, the academic and epigraphic area, and in the esoteric occult dimension of the runes, that guy has largely gone understudied. But again, I just want to make this point really clear, that their historical analysis of the runes and what they meant in that time period in modern and contemporary people's spiritual and esoteric and occult practices, they don't have to line up. Innovation in religion is actually what keeps religion alive, and the idea that one could look to the past for inspiration and develop new kinds of spiritualities, that's amazing. That should be praised, and it should at no level be downplayed because we don't find actual versions of that in the past. Just because we don't see someone casting the runes in the way that one might see at a bloat now, that doesn't mean that one person's modern spirituality or someone's modern way of engaging with the runes is somehow less than or spiritually bereft because we don't find archaeological or historical evidence of something similar. Spiritual authenticity isn't to be found in some direct causal link from antiquity till now. That can make you feel cool, I suppose, but every generation is always innovating and renovating what it means to be religious vis-a-vis various kinds of symbols and spiritualities. And so to historicize the runes, for instance, in such a way that we just don't find much in the way of magic and mysticism, especially as it's being done now, doesn't somehow mean that what's being done now isn't authentic spirituality to the very people doing it. Historicizing is just that. It's historicizing. It isn't demoting what people do now in terms of their spiritual and religious practices. Those practices have their value all unto themselves. But as I mentioned a moment ago, it's somewhat ironic that both the academic epigraphic origins of runology, but also the esoteric origins of runology, basically go unstudied, or at least, I think, dramatically understudied. But they have their origins in one extraordinary fellow, Johannes Bureus, born in 1568 and dying in 1652, is the foundational figure in both the esoteric academic runology, but also, which is much lesser known, for the effective invention of modern esoteric runology. He would be the first scholar to document hundreds of runic inscriptions in his native Sweden, some of which, by the way, have subsequently been lost, and we're lucky to have his notes. And in 1611, he would publish the first Swedish alphabet book, in which he included his somewhat idiosyncratic version of the younger Futhark runic alphabet and the Our Father prayer in that alphabet in contemporary Swedish. He was born near Uppsala, an ancient Norse cultic center, maybe the ancient Norse cultic center. He learned to read the runes from remote farmers, we're told, which is a real possibility, by the way, considering that runic writing and runic calendar keeping continued on in Sweden well after it had gone extinct in other regions. He would go on to first publish his very large runic board starting in 1599, which was a broadsheet of ever-expanding details featuring a wide range of runic symbols, bind runes, comparison with other alphabets, runic calendars, depictions of various rune stones, heraldic information, and a bunch more. He really packed it in there with his rune sheets. Thus, along with his Danish colleague and rival, Olaus Vermius, Bureus is rightly recalled as one of the founders of modern runology, exoteric and esoteric. However, like many of his contemporaries, Bureus's interest in ancient writing systems, the runes specifically, went well beyond mere antiquarian, linguistic, and epigraphic interest. For him, they were also the source of profound occult wisdom. And to understand that, we have to understand that Bureus was a proponent of what is now called Gothicism, which, despite the fact that Bauhaus's Bela Lugosi's Dead is playing in your head right now, has little to do with that. Rather, Gothicism was a nascent form of nationalism which argued that the Goths were the progenitors of all Germanic peoples, and that they had their origins in Sweden or somewhere nearby in Scandinavia, dependent on the Gothicist. Further, people like Bureus held that the Hyperboreans had fled to the Baltics prior to the destruction of the Tower of Babel, especially the descendants of Ashkenaz, one of the sons of Noah, whose name would become Skanzea. Ashkenaz, Skanzea, Scandinavia. And Zalmoxis, mentioned by Herodotus, was the Hyperborean philosopher that would become the teacher of Pythagoras, who would then teach Plato, and thus all of philosophy has its origins in the far north, along with the religious prophet Adulruna, whose name is going to matter a good bit more in a moment. So Gothicism is basically claiming that everything came from the Goths. A much later version of Gothicism would actually even locate Atlantis in Sweden, because why not? Bureus's position was well in step with the larger Renaissance tendency to locate true, authentic wisdom in the remote past, surviving only through a tiny group of sages, which in the literature all vie for the title of archsage or ultimate hierophant, whether it is the Israelite Moses, the Egyptian Hermes Trismegistus, the Persian Zoroaster, the Greek Pythagoras, or, in the case of Gothicism, a Hyperborean equivalent, which would give rise to the great list of the likes of Charlemagne and serve the, well, nakedly propagandistic interests of Sweden as it grew to be a world power during this period. Gothicism was, in a way, the Nordic expression of the Renaissance desire for the perennial philosophy and the Prisca Theologia, with the center of all the important stuff now being moved to the far north, to Hyperborea. But not with so much Conan. But kinda. And like his colleagues to the south, Bureus put enormous interest in the written remains of the ancients. But at this juncture in the history of the study of Old Norse, and Old Norse religion for that matter, well, all of that was hardly even in its infancy yet. Texts like the Gesta Danorum would only come to print in 1514, and the Codex Regius, our only source for much of our information on Old Norse religion, would only come to be even discovered in 1643. Thus, Bureus lived at an odd moment in the development of our scholarly understanding of Norse language and myth. He could access, and did access, hundreds, and he could decipher many of those hundreds of monumental runestones, and given his belief in Gothicism, he was also convinced that the runes themselves were much more than an ancient Germanic writing system, and at the same time, he didn't have much standing in his way to kind of wildly riff on what he thought was going on under the hood, so to speak, of these exoteric monumental inscriptions. He could just kind of let his imagination do what he liked, because there was nothing to really check the brakes, because we really hadn't discovered the texts that would form the bumpers on what we now understand to be the fundamental structure of Norse mythology, again, like the Codex Regius, the Gesta Danorum, or other similar texts. Much in the same way that Renaissance scholars had inherited the symbolic and mystical understanding of the Egyptian hieroglyphics from scholars like Horapollo, his Hieroglyphica, which certainly fired the imagination of the Renaissance while being a complete red herring from actually being able to read Egyptian text. Horapollo's Hieroglyphica is fantastic as a piece of imaginative speculation about the nature of the Egyptian hieroglyphs, but doesn't at all give us an insight into how to read them. In fact, it made it worse learning how to read them. Bureus's would do the same thing. He would infuse the runic script with a profoundly mystical meaning, thus making him the founder of Esoteric Runology. Bureus's interest in esotericism seems to have begun around 1591 when he received a copy of the Grimoire of Planetary Spiritual Magic, the Arbitel. Now, I've made a whole episode about the Arbitel if you want to check that out to get a good sense of what he was reading. He may have gotten that text from his father-in-law, who apparently had an interest in the occult. In fact, he would be accused by a local woman of such instruction, of him instructing her in the occult after she went on a journey through the heavens, and in 1601, she was burned alive, and then Bureus' father-in-law would be beheaded for heresy. So there's that. Not that Bureus seemed to have gotten the message. However, his interest in the runes would begin in earnest around this exact same time, before he would eventually graduate and come into many government positions. He was a tutor to royalty, he was a state librarian, and much else besides. I mean, the guy was incredible. He's, again, sort of like the Swedish John Dee in a way. And it was probably in the first decade of the 17th century that he began his interest in esoteric runology. Bureus seems to have taken over his esoteric methodology primarily from the field of sort of post-Renaissance Hermeticism and Kabbalah. That's going to be the main way he's going to develop this esoteric runology. Specifically, he knew how Kabbalists took the Hebrew language, which he knew, and the Hebrew script as having both an exoteric and an esoteric dimension, with the esoteric dimensions of the language providing a gateway into the realm of the divine and the occult nature of reality. Of course, he could read of such conceptions in the popular text, The Three Books of Occult Philosophy by Cornelius Agrippa, but they were also imbued in the metaphysical, linguistic speculations, the symbolic speculations of that time. Of those speculations, the most impactful was no doubt his reading of Dr. John Dee's 1564 Modus Hieroglyphica, which argued that the singular symbol contained massive metaphysical power, that is, the symbol of the hieroglyphic monad. Further mutation and geometric analysis of that symbol could be used to unlock the keys to both natural and mystical forces, leading, in John Dee's mind at least, to a revolution in all branches of human knowledge and human religion and spirituality. Again, you can check out episodes on both Agrippa and a full 3-part series on Dee's hieroglyphic monad if you want more information about those, in the cards above and the links in the description. Further, Bureus adopted from Pico della Mirandola's radical conception of human dignitas, human dignity, which could only be fully realized through mystical means. He had an especial interest in the Heptapolis, which is Pico's commentary on the Hebrew Bible, where Pico describes the symbolic construction of the Mishkan, or the tabernacle, as revealing truths about the totality of the natural and supernatural divine world. Thus, sacred, symbolic, and geometric relations were revelatory of both natural and divine relations, and of, well, the structure of the whole cosmos. He was also, that is to say, Bureus was also taken with Kunrath's vision of alchemy as the means by which the natural world was transformed, but, and through a very powerful use of allegorical extension, spiritual transformation proceeded as well. Specifically, Kunrath details 7 steps on the way to the divine. One must learn physics, medicine, alchemy, natural magic, hyperphysical magic, which allowed you to talk to angels and things like that, and finally, Kabbalah, whereby the archetype of the human being was restored to itself. The divine image was restored to itself. Now, despite the early appearance on this scale, the alchemical processes are actually present at each step of that process. Indeed, knowledge of alchemy constituted for Kunrath theosophia, a kind of God's eye view of both the macrocosm and the microcosm, especially as applied to biblical exegesis, by which one could learn both history and spiritual transcendence. Now, with all of this, Bureus would declare in 1613 that he received knowledge concerning the hidden truth, and when I found it, Bureus, I knew it to be my duty to become its apostle. All of which coincided with the publication of the first Rosicrucian manuscripts, which up to that point had been circulating in manuscript. And by 1616, Bureus himself would attach his name to a collection of Rosicrucian poems. I mean, the guy's knee-deep in all of the Hermeticism and Esotericism. In short, Bureus was deeply informed by the explosion of Renaissance esotericism and early modern occultism, and the avant-garde of the Rosicrucian Enlightenment, and all of that esoteric genius was then applied to discovering and expositing the occult wisdom of the ancient Scandinavians as encoded in the mysterious runes in his Adulruna Rediviva, or the rebirth of the noble runes. Now, he had begun the Adulruna Rediviva as early as 1605 and would write and rewrite this text throughout his entire lifetime. And while it was never formally published, recall the fate of his father-in-law, despite the fact that Bureus had really great, royal connections, 6 manuscripts of the text survive in versions in Swedish and in Latin. Sadly, no modern edition exists so far as I know, and it would actually require an incredibly careful critical apparatus to trace the development of the text through time, both in Swedish and in Latin. Now, for this episode, I've consulted a Latin manuscript of 1642, and I'll admit that it's a positively dizzying text. In fact, the only thing that I could compare it to, and I do suggest that it's the primary influence upon the text, is Dr. John Dee's Monus Hieroglyphica. And honestly, if I hadn't written a whole thesis on John Dee's Monus Hieroglyphica, I don't think I could have much made heads or tails of the Adulruna Rediviva. But let's give it a try. What does this text say? Bureus, like virtually all his contemporaries, understands language to be a mediator between the creator and the created, between the divine and the human image of the divine. And the runes, as a primeval alphabet, much like Hebrew in the Kabbalah, are the very stuff of that mediation. A bridge up and down from the world of the divine to the human, and from the human back to the divine. But the runes have 2 natures. An exoteric dimension, like those carved upon stones, and still, for Bureus, the most noble and enduring of all media, he argues. They're still there since primeval times. But also, of course, an esoteric spiritual dimension. These esoteric runes are the Adulruna, or the noble runes, with the major visual difference between them being that the normal and the noble runes is that the noble runes are often rotated 90 degrees, and they often seem to prefer their staveless forms, especially the U and R runes, making them mirror images of each other, along with the M and the L runes being in reversed order with the normal rune run. This is probably because Bureus is following the Swedish runic calendars, which no one really talks about for some reason. There were runic calendars being used at this time. I say that no one, when Runa was actually looking at this script, he pointed out that he noticed the same thing, that no one was talking about these runic calendars, and so he wrote a whole book on it. So check out Rune's book on the Swedish runic calendars. But Bureus bases his system on the younger Futhark, but he deletes the final rune ear, thus giving him 3 sets of 5 runes. Further, the runes also represent numbers, and again, a bit like Hebrew and Kabbalah, but only the odd numbers, counting in sets of 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9, 100, 300, 500, etc. These 3 sets constitute separate metaphysical registers for Bureus. They are the generators, the generation, and the generated. Now, already we can see the first esoteric dimension manifesting of these runes. Rather than having a run of runes called the Futhark, we now have a run of runes called the Futhor, or Father, the prime generator. Now, while the manuscripts of the text differ, the basic structure remains the same. The first section is the recumbent stone, or the fallen stone, which details the exoteric dimension of the runes. I mean, still pretty esoteric, frankly. The next, or the falling stone, places the runes into crosses of 5 runes and describes their various esoteric dimensions and relations. The runic cross employs all of the noble runes into a single cross shape and details their various esoteric relations, and it's a bit like the Tree of Life in the Kabbalah, but does a lot of heavy lifting. The final sections are the Shepherd's Royal Office and describe a garment inscribed with runes, which isn't very much described in detail, and the Treasury of the Noble Runes describes a very complex ontological primitive symbol from which all the noble runes are extracted via geometric and mystical means. Again, this section is very much like D's Monas Hieroglyphica. And the final section I should mention here doesn't have anything to do with the runes at all. It's the mystical origins of the 3 crowns of the Swedish coat of arms, which matter if you work for the crown and you don't want to get your head chopped off like your father-in-law. So you spend the last part of the book really pumping up the Swedish royal family. The first section of the book, the recumbent or fallen stone, discusses the meaning of each of the individual runes in their metaphysical and symbolic power. Again, like I said, it's supposed to be exoteric, but it ain't. Interestingly enough, these discussions often don't follow the various rune poems that were available to Bureus and to us now, and only really do so as a kind of afterthought most of the time, thus putting the original esoteric system of Bureus at odds with much of the contemporary runic esotericism that you might find, I don't know, in the Llewellyn book. Thus, his first rune is called Frey, the rune of Freya, and is associated with fertility, and only by extension with fe, or money in the form of cattle, I suppose. The rune typically known as Thor's, he calls Thor, and he associates it with that god, but also with the Torah, the law of God. Thor, Torah. As he has it, the next one is called Odin, is linked with Mercury, and Odin obviously is connected with destiny or fate. The first section of this text proceeds in this manner through all the various runes. The next section, the Falling Stone, offers esoteric versions of these runes, now placed on 3 sides of a cube in a cross pattern. Bureus then proceeds to explain the mystical and theological relations of some of these runic configurations. Of some interest, of a lot of interest, is the revelation as to how the knowledge of the Christian Trinity was actually best preserved by the ancient Scandinavians in the form of Thor the Father, Odin the Son, and Freya the Holy Spirit. Only when southern wizards came north pretending to be one of these gods did the knowledge of the true Trinity, the actual Trinity, and the noble runes descend into heathen decadence. I mean, again, I'm not sure that many modern neo-pagans are going to be on the same page here with Bureus, but in these pages, he works out his Norse Christian runic trinity, the other side of the face of these runes for grace, nod, sex, skön, and glory are in a row, literally making the word not archon, or the Kabbalistic term notericon. Indeed, he sometimes refers to his system as the Notericon Suecia in Latin, the Swedish Notericon. It's like IKEA Kabbalah. I mean, you can see it too, right? Like the Tree of Life, like in IKEA style. And you move them around and you balance them all out, and, you know, the Messiah comes and you get some meatballs. I mean, he doesn't call it Runic Kabbalah for nothing. At any rate, the runic cross is composed of all 15 of the noble runes, 7 ascending and descending, representing the spiritual process of procession and recession, with 2 arms of 4 runes in mirror image of each other. Remember, he uses the staveless runes versions of U and R, so they can kind of mirror image each other and look a bit like a gate. In the macrocosm, the cross represents the crucifixion of Christ Odin. These are further broken down into different sections to reveal the fundamental nature of the universe, the alchemical procedures by which it exists, the salvation history in the form of the virgin birth, execution, and resurrection of Christ Odin, the evil trolls that threaten the righteous, and the redemptive path of love and faith. Yep, trolls. We're in Sweden. It's troll country. Thanks, Jesus Odin. But the vertical shaft describes a complex runic journey into the physical realm and then back to the spiritual realm, and even complicated gematria-like calculations, which generate years like 1648, the year of the Peace of Westphalia, and 1666, the year that Bureus thought that Christ was going to come back. But we just got calculus. Honestly, these sections, and at least the time I had to work with them, are profoundly difficult to make much sense of, and the next sections are even more obscure. The shepherd in the royal office depicts the runes spread over various garments of a royal figure or king, but these aren't really otherwise explained. My Kabbalistic mind goes to like Adam Kadmon stuff, but no idea. The next section, and the final one to deal specifically with the runes, is the Treasury of the Noble Runes, and it presents a kind of metaphysical symbol or geometric matrix. He in fact calls it a divine name. It's in fact the Alruna, the most esoteric form of the runes, out of which the noble runes are extracted. Remember, I talked about the prophetess Alruna? This is her, in a way. It's, again, itself the primordial runes out of which all runes are said to emerge. Again, akin to John Dee's hieroglyphic monad. By parsing, bisecting, transposing, and inverting areas of various aspects of the symbol, does one extract the various noble runes, and they emerge from more and more esoteric relations as the combinations goes. Again, it's honestly pretty dizzying. It's hard to keep track of exactly how this whole system coheres together. That's true for John Dee too, but it's also true here. But at the end, a geometric system is provided for the extraction of all the noble runes, and I think I have some sense of how that's supposed to work. I mean, I probably don't. As I mentioned, the final section of the book is an esoteric analysis of the 3 crowns of the Swedish royal coat of arms. It has nothing to do with the runes, really, but it is connected to the runes by the so-called Mora stones, which still survive, and I think they're actually encased in like a little house now. Those stones were actually the subject of investigation by Bureus, and they do include a runic inscription nearby to some other stones which have the 3 crowns of the royal Swedish family inscribed on them, though the inscription of those crowns is from a much later period. I don't know if Bureus knew that, and again, this text was functioning a little bit as Swedish propaganda. I mean, Gothicism is basically Swedish nationalism, or if he didn't know that and thought there was still esoteric stuff to be had from the 3 crowns. And there's all kinds of things in there, like the 3 crowns represent the crowns of the king, the warrior, and the priest, and various things like that. So a not uninteresting section, but not really connected to the runes. All in all, the Adulruna Rediviva Su Sapientia Severorum Veterum, or the wisdom of the old Swedes, is a bewildering treatise of Hermetic, biblical, Kabbalistic, and Runic lore all its own. It's amazing. But sadly, Bureus' life and work continues to linger in obscurity. The only major study of his life and works remains in Swedish, which I can't read, and it's about 100-year-old now. His esoteric works, ranging from his fragmentary notebooks to virtually complete works like the Adulruna Rediviva, have no modern edition, and there are dozens of texts like this. However, Håkansson, Ackerman, and other folks like the occult scholars Flowers and Carlson are attempting to make his ideas more accessible and to give us a better glimpse into the early history of what will become Esoteric Runology, something again that is incredibly popular now. Bureus is a fantastic example of how early scientific, linguistic, epigraphic, and historical interest could engage with and be informed by profound mystical speculation and esoteric spirituality without even a whisper of cognitive or religious dissonance. Exoteric and exoteric runology will no doubt continue to fire the imagination, and hopefully future scholarship will help to clarify and really appreciate the position Johannes Bureus had at the foundations of both. We just need to get an academic edition of his writings. However, if you can read Swedish, which I can't, or you can read Latin, which I can, that will say even if you could read this, it's not always clear that I understand what's happening. You can check out several manuscripts of the Adulruna out online. It's a really beautiful text, just regardless of what it says. But again, make sure to check out Dr. Rasmussen's excellent episode over at his channel. I will say that Nordic Animism is a channel that I really appreciate when it comes to Nordic spirituality, because unfortunately so much of Nordic spirituality has been hijacked by evil people, the most boring kind of evil, like racism. I really appreciate his take where it's a real embrace of Nordic spirituality, but without all of that nationalism and racism, which it doesn't need. And frankly, I find that to be horrifyingly tragic, where an entire group of people, Scandinavian people, Anglo-Saxon people, can't use their symbols, or it's difficult for them to use their indigenous symbols, like the runes, for fear of being labeled a racist or a bigot, because bigots and racists have hijacked their symbolism. I find that to be just dreadful. So I'm really appreciative of his work, and I highly recommend you check out his channel, subscribe, especially if you're, again, interested in the intersection of Nordic spirituality and animism. It's fantastic stuff with a lot of spiritual and academic rigor, so check out Runa's channel. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.